Hi, it's Penny here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Crown of Stars series by Kate Elliott. So this is a 7-book epic fantasy, and for me, it took me at least a year, if not a year and a half, to get through this series. And because it took me so long, I talked about this book quite a bit, and I've seen quite a few people say as a result that they were going to pick this book series up. And while that is exciting to hear that people are picking a book series up that I did enjoy, there were also things about this that I didn't like so much. And so then I'm a little bit concerned that people might pick this series up and not like it. So I guess what I wanted to do in this video is talk a little bit about the things that I really loved in this series and also the things that I didn't really like, so that maybe you can get a better idea of whether it would actually be something you like. Anyway, high level, this is set in a alternate Europe in kind of medieval times, and we have the typical thing going on where there is this battle for the throne, different people kind of vying for power within this kingdom, as well as there kind of being this bigger threat from outside the kingdom. So we have the Ica, which I think initially are described as dragon people, and while that is accurate, I think it can also be misleading, and I think as I got further through the series I described them more as rock people. They're really just these very large vicious warriors that do also have these shamans that can do magic. So they have been regularly attacking this kingdom, but now they're really making a concerted effort to take over. And there is also these other people called the Cumin. Cumin? I wonder if that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, the Cumin are really cool because they have these like metal wings that they attach to themselves so they can fly, and they also have another kind of like magic users. So there's quite a lot of different magical things going on in this world, which is something I liked. Kind of the variety of the different kinds of people and cultures is something. So different cultures is something that Kate Elliott, or at least in the things that I've read by her, it's something she's really great at. So as well as the Ica and the Cumin, we have kind of these elves that were in the past were kind of sent to another place, and it's not really clear what's gone on with that in the beginning, but there are these kind of ghosts of these other I always call them elves. They're called the Aoi, and they're kind of like elves, kind of, and their part of the story has a lot to do with like other dimensions, and there's kind of portals where people can travel to other places, either in this world or in others. And we learn a lot more about that through one of our main characters. So one of our main characters is Leath. She is a young woman who has been raised by her father, and they've always been in hiding. She doesn't really know the full details of it, but it seems like he is knowledgeable in this mathematical astronomy type magic that is outlawed by the church. Not something that you should be doing. And also maybe there's some people who have these powers who are also after him. So him and Leath have always been on the run through a lot of this series. We've got Leath learning about this cool mathematical astronomy magic and trying to gain as much knowledge as she can, while also trying to keep away from the people who aren't very happy about her using that magic. So I will say there is, I think in the third book, quite a big bit where she is learning about this magic, and I saw one review say that they really hated all the repetitive stuff about the religion and the astronomy. Now I personally really loved getting into the details of that and trying to understand how it works, and seeing how like real life astronomy was influencing this fictional magical world. But I think if you like the idea of getting into the details of astronomical magic, then you might actually like that bit. But also I wouldn't really call this like a hard magic system, so if you want your magic system to like fully conform to a lot of rules, this isn't really that either. Then our other main character is this young man named Elaine, and he has been raised an orphan working on this farm, but then it comes into question whether he might actually be the illegitimate son of this count of the area, so Count Leverstein. And the big clue is that there are these dogs that the Count's family line have always had, and it's only been the family that's been able to control them, but Elaine has no problems with them. And actually throughout the series you get a lot of these dogs, and he has a close bond with them throughout the series. So if you like dogs, you might like that aspect. And it's through Elaine that we also get a connection with one of these Ica, so these rock people that I was talking about. And through that we learn quite a lot about these other people and the way that they are created. So I'm saying kind of Leith and Elaine are the main characters, but to be honest, they're really the most main characters for the first 2 books. I'm now remembering that the second book also has some other characters that get quite a lot of focus. But still, you definitely get a lot of Leith and Elaine in the first 2 books, and then after that is when it really starts to get very sprawling. So I think what's worth noting is this series initially was going to be 2 trilogies, but then after the first 2 books she was like, maybe I need 4 books to tell the story. And then somewhere along the way she was also like, this is not 2 trilogies, this is just gonna have to be one big series. I think possibly because everything that she's created is so interwoven with each other, it was probably very hard to split the stories. And then for a while it kind of felt like every book had a little prelude from the author saying, hey, I thought it was going to be this many books, but it's actually going to be more. And in fact, the last 2 books in the series were going to be 1 book, but they were so long that the publisher insisted on breaking them into 2. You can kind of see the 6th book is very fat. Like, they get this one, not so fat, but they get fatter and fatter as they go until these ones are kind of back to the same width as the initial couple of books. Also, yes, I really wish I had all the series in these fancy door editions with the Jodie A. Lee art. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, I got most of these for like $2 or $3 from a book fair. So they're not all matching, but also, I think if I had paid like $30 or $40 each for these books, I would be a lot more disappointed in the ending than I actually am. So let's talk about that. I think if you really want a book series to be focusing in on 1 or 2 characters and telling the story through that, this is not going to be the series for you, especially by the ending. We have just gotten so many more characters introduced. And in some ways, I was a little bit frustrated by that. You definitely get big parts of characters, or at least I definitely got big parts of characters that I wasn't interested in. And later on in the books you get a lot less of Leith and Elaine, and there would be, I think there was maybe even 1 book where we barely got any of Leith for the whole thing, and I found that really frustrating because I really just wanted to know what was happening with her story. But at the same time, there were some of these new characters that were introduced that I really loved. One example would be Rosvita, who is an older woman and a historian, and I liked how she was a hero of the story while still like not being a warrior. She's just a scholar. Anyway, I really love Rosvita and the fact that we get these different perspectives throughout the story. But I think in the end, because Kate Elliott introduced so much into this world, it was really hard for her to pull it back together in the end. As well, I don't really think that Kate Elliott writes plot stories so much. Even though there is an interesting plot here, she's much more focused on the individual characters' journeys as well as the world that she's building and the themes that she's trying to investigate. As well, I would say this series actually climaxes at book 5, where this big cataclysmic event happens and a lot of our characters do very heroic or very stupid things. And the bad guys are probably at their worst. And then the final 2 books, which as I said were only going to be 1 book, but this final section is really about the aftermath of this cataclysmic event and kind of trying to pull the world back together. And that part felt in a lot of ways really anticlimactic because it was so much lower action than what we'd had in the 5th book. But at the same time, I enjoyed the realism of it. So I think if you're not just there for the action, you might enjoy the ending. I was a little bit frustrated though because so much of the story does come across as very realistic. It's then very frustrating when some parts of the ending feel a little bit convenient because she does actually manage to bring a lot of threads together, but very quickly, which just contrasts so much to the slow pace of a lot of these books. And I really just think that's because she was, you know, pressured to finish it off in a single book, and even that turned out to be 2 more books. Still, I should say, if we compare this to something like Wheel of Time, which also became very sprawling, it's good that we do get that faster pace at the end, because otherwise maybe it would have been 15 books like The Wheel of Time. And another book series that I do actually often see this series compared to is A Song of Ice and Fire, and at least this book series has an ending, right? Even if maybe it wasn't everything that I would have wanted it to be, at least it's an ending, and a lot of the characters' stories do get wrapped up. So since I've mentioned A Song of Ice and Fire, let's compare and contrast them a little bit, because I think that might just be a way to talk through some of the other elements of the series. So firstly, even though a lot of really horrible, violent things do happen in this series, I don't feel like it's quite as violent and dark as A Song of Ice and Fire. Although admittedly it's been a while since I've read A Song of Ice and Fire at this point, because I'm waiting to do a reread when the next book comes out. But I think even though a lot of these characters are flawed in the same way that A Song of Ice and Fire characters are flawed, we probably have more good and heroic characters, and I think it's a series with a lot more hope than A Song of Ice and Fire has, although maybe the final books will turn it around with A Song of Ice and Fire. I don't know. Also, I don't know a lot about European history, but from everything I've read about this series and from the level of detail, I get the feeling that this is a lot more historically accurate. So maybe that's something you might appreciate about it. Or maybe you're like me and you don't really care. Although I do like some parts that feel very real, like when different characters are in completely different parts of the country or different parts of the continent and they can't communicate, so like the lack of information. And I think at the beginning of the series there's kind of a magical way that people are able to communicate, but that does break down at a certain point, and so then you have to deal with the fact that there just is no way of communicating with people beyond sending a messenger that's going to take months to get there. As well, like Game of Thrones, even though we have a range of different characters' perspectives, a lot of our main characters are younger and trying to deal with learning about the world and all the disasters that are going on around them, at the same time as kind of trying to find their place in the world. And of course, the most obvious comparison is the fact that we have this power play going on for the throne. I will say, I think A Crown of Stars has less factions vying for the throne, and it's maybe less complex, but again, I think maybe more realistic as a result. I feel like if anyone who loves A Song of Ice and Fire is watching this, I'm going to get hate comments. Anyway, another thing we have, as well as this battle for the throne, is a more dark magic kind of aspect. So I think I talked a little bit about this maths and astronomy magic. There is also this group of mathematici who are trying to, it's hard to describe without any context, but they're kind of trying to repeat a wrong that was done in the past. And debatably they're doing it to protect their people, but it is something that will cause a lot of harm, perhaps even more harm than they realize. Oh, and we also have demons. So Game of Thrones has dragons and maybe some other mythological creatures. You know, right at this moment I can't remember. There's definitely some, right? Anyway, in Crown of Stars we do also have a little bit of dragons, but just a tiny bit. Definitely a lot less than you get in the Song of Ice and Fire. But you also get heaps of other mythological creatures, like there is mermaids and goblins and griffins and centaurs. There's a phoenix. There's possibly more than I've forgotten. And I really loved the fullness that added to the world. I will admit though, you don't get a lot of these different mythological creatures. Maybe the ones you get the most of is the centaurs, and even that's not till later in the series. But I haven't read many series that have interesting centaurs in them. If you do know some, I'd love a recommendation. But if you really love centaurs, you might want to push through for the later books in this series. Also, while I'm talking about the centaurs, I should also talk about how in this world there's often a lot of women in power. So the centaurs are an example. And there's one part that I absolutely loved where one of these powerful woman centaurs is basically like, men shouldn't be in power, they're just far too emotional. And throughout the series, I think Kate Elliott does a really good job of like flipping situations across different genders. So she'll often show a particular situation like a character being raped, which generally is portrayed in a certain gender, so like a woman being raped. I should say, trigger warnings for rape in this series for sure. But then though, she'll also do the same situation again, but with the genders flipped, and look at kind of the similarities and the differences with it. I think there's quite a few times in the series where that kind of thing happens. Not not just the rape, but that looking at particular situations from different gender perspectives. Another theme that Kate Elliott gets into in this series, where I think she uses different perspectives really well, is religious instability. I did see an interview with her, I think it was a Reddit AMA actually, where she talked about how she wanted to show how often in history religions have been very unstable, and we tend to think about religions as being very traditional and unchanging, but in reality, or at least especially in history, that's not how it has been. So in this world, as is common in these kind of epic fantasies, the church has a lot of political power, but there are also kind of these different factions and magical type things happening that mean the shape of the religion is changing, and there's people pushing for that and people pushing against that, and it really does go in some interesting directions throughout the series. Lastly, I do just want to talk a little bit about the writing style. I personally found it quite dense and slow paced. I have seen some people say that they thought it was fast paced, which kind of blows my mind and makes me wonder what kind of books they normally read. But compared to the books I normally read, these were very slow paced, which is why it took me so long to get through them. And I just think every sentence and every paragraph has so much information packed into it that I felt like if I went through too fast, I was missing things. And I did actually finish this series off via audiobook, and while that was really helpful to get through it, I definitely feel like I did miss some things. And now the more I think about this series, actually going through it to create this review, I kind of want to reread it at some point, but it's such a massive series that that's a big thing, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by the idea of it. But I do think on a reread you would pick up on a lot more, and just because there is so much in the series, I'm sure you would pick up on more on a reread. But I definitely think, like, if you're going into this series, it is quite a big commitment. You could potentially, though, just read the first 2 books if you're willing to, like, have an open-ended ending. There is kind of a happy-ish ending at the end of the second book. I do also think, again, you could probably stop at the end of the 5th book if you just want to have the big cataclysm and not really worry about whether everybody is okay after that, or like not really worry about how everything's going to come together, how the world is going to be okay after that. I think just in general, this is a series where I would recommend trying the writing style before you mentally commit to reading the whole thing. Anyway, I guess that is everything I have to say about this series right now. Definitely, if you have any questions for me, I'm not necessarily an expert, and it did take me a long time to read this series, so I've probably forgotten some things, but I would love to talk with you about this series down in the comments, especially if you have read it. I would love to know who your favorite character was, especially if it wasn't Leath or Elaine. And of course, let me know if you're thinking about reading this series. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.